Well, my name is Orville Vernon Burton. I'm the Judge Matthew Perry Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University, and I spent 34 years as a professor of history, the University Distinguished Teacher Scholar in African American Studies and Sociology at the University of Illinois. Retired there and have been teaching at Clemson since 2010. Critical race theory is in the news today, and quite a bit, and it's often quite mischaracterized. Critical race theory really began in the 1970s, and it was, in fact, by legal scholars looking at how the law interacted with race. It's associated particularly with a number of people, but it's really the founding fathers often looked at as Derek Bell, who was the first African American who taught at Harvard University Law School. Kimberly Crenshaw and Pat Williams are three others who have looked at it. And basically, they're saying that civil rights was not working, that despite Brown v. Board, and then later the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that you still had inequalities in America. The idea was that racism was pervasive, that it's not just a personal, that there are bigots and racists that are causing these, but structurally, racism, they argued, was embedded in Americans' institutions, that despite America's commitment from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of Equality, that the institutions themselves, in fact, fostered inequality over time. And in fact, some of the criticism had been that that took away the moral responsibility of bigots and others who had racist ideas. But it says that racism functions in the society. And in fact, there are at least three different ways that these legal scholars put this together. That it's a theoretical framework. There's not just one thing that is critical racism. Derek Bell, who is sort of seen as the father, sees that particularly with Brown v. Board and supposedly the ending of segregation, and that's different, that we've never really had integration in American society. What we've had is a law, Brown v. Board, that replaced Plessy v. Ferguson, which is said that separate but equal was okay. But what we've never had is integration, just that separate is not legal anymore. So with Bale, what he sees as that there'd been very little progress, and that what is really happening is that particularly institutions, and for him in particular, those who were in power, which is generally whites, are benefiting. And the only time that progress is made for black people was when it fit in with the power institutions. It was in their benefit. And then you had, on top of that, Kimberly Crenshaw, who argued about intersectionality, that people can have multiple identities. Therefore, if you are a woman, racism, in effect, or institutions' power affect white women different than black women. So what you have is more of an approach to examine society, not one thing, this critical race theory. It doesn't mean at all, as people are interpreted on certain political spectrum, that white people are intrinsically racist. What it says is that institutions benefit whites at the expense of other groups of people. The emphasis is on group dynamics. And the critics of that, mainly from the left, have actually said that it overlooks the critical role of individual behavior by saying that it's all placed into an institutional framework. But clearly, institutions have fallen very short of American ideals. Uh, that what has happened, the institutions have, some argue, perpetuated racial ideals over time. And this goes into the actual framework of this intersectionality, that you can belong to different groups at different times. So, what do institutions versus people are doing? The persistent racial sort of injustice that comes out of American institutions, where it's going. To give some specific examples, mortgage lending is one of those. A person who is loaning money may not be a racist at all, doesn't even realize what is happening. But the rules that are set up by banks, so the individual who is in fact um, loaning money may not be racist at all, but the bank's rules, the accumulation over the years of property or or wealth by whites has made it harder, or where African Americans might live makes it harder compared to where whites to get the same sort of mortgage thing. So that's just one example, and we can do a lot more over time, because I've talked about a lot of these in the book I co-authored with Armin Durfner, the great civil rights lawyer, Justice Deferred Race in the Supreme Court, how we had a huge affirmative action program, federally and state supported, for whites that did not include black people, that helped accumulate wealth over the years for whites and disadvantaged black people, as opposed to just thinking, well, slavery ended in 1863, 1865, that the institutions themselves continued to perpetuate disadvantages for minority. Um, so structures, practices, habits all perpetuate this disparity for African Americans. A good example, of course, is a criminal justice system. I wrote an essay years ago called The Black Squint of the Law. And that was a quote from a young graduate student who himself was very bigoted and racist. He was at Vanderbilt at the time. He went to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1895 that becomes the Constitution of 1896. And he talked about the black squint of the law. That is, the white legislators wrote into the Constitution certain laws that would be prosecuted, that they believed that African Americans might commit, like stealing a pig or trying to leave a contract. I mean, the extreme one was they believed that black men might beat their wives. So you would then be convicted of that as a felony, and you would not be able to vote anymore after that conviction. Whereas if you killed your wife, which is what, in fact, white men often did, you would not lose your vote. That's the most extreme example of that. But basically, what
That
you
is a
have is incarceration rates today. You know, you have harsher policies. One that's most famous, of course, is the drug wars, where you could be doing cocaine, which is something that whites do, plus crack cocaine, which blacks do, and you have harsher penalties, marijuana, things like that, decent job opportunities, homelessness, poverty, all those kind of things. Instead of dealing with those, you deal with the criminal justice system with different things. And when we have a crime wave, one of the things that happens, of course, is that we have more police enforcement, put more police there, not to deal with things like job training programs,